Hey, welcome back, everyone. This is Ian, and joining me today, I have Azadi Bogolubov. And Azadi's been a developer for roughly the last decade. Is that right, Azadi?
That's correct.
Awesome. So he's going to tell us a little bit about his journey as a developer, kind of what he's doing today, and also impart some wisdom on some of you beginner developers looking to get into the industry, or those of you that are already in the industry looking to level up. So, Azadi, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey that got you to where you are today?
Absolutely. So as Ian said, my name is Azadi Bogolubov. I am a instructor, engineer, architect, and manager. In my 10 years in the field, I've worked in all those spaces. When the pandemic started, I launched a program called Degrees of Freedom, where I offered anybody that needed it 10 free hours of mentoring, as there was a great need and the world was shook up. Fast forward a few years now, I'm offering resume writing services, mentoring, coaching, and just overall advice to anybody in the aspiring or growing in dev space. So, right now, most recently, I found myself out of work in August and I'm looking for my next role, which could well be something in Java. It could be working as a manager or it could be working as an architect. I'm very comfortable in each space and I love helping people. So,
A lot of the senior level engineers that I run into do some form of mentoring, not necessarily for pay or as a side hustle, but it sounds like you, in addition to the work that you've done over the years, have also kind of built this thing up on the side where you're finding entry level, mid level engineers and kind of imparting some advice on them from the things that you've learned in your career. So that's really cool. And then now recently you're doing like resume review and things like that, which is huge right now. I know a lot of people are finding themselves back on the job market. So you mentioned that you yourself are looking for your next role. What does that look like for you? How is looking for a job now different than what it looked like the last time you were out looking for work?
that's a very good question, Ian. Thing is when I came out of school in 2014, I found that the market was a nightmare. Everything was looking for senior level skills for entry level jobs. And this kind of reminds me of 2014 in some ways, coming out of the Great Recession. And yet in other ways, we didn't have the remote work like we did back then. And so at that point, basically everybody's in the office, and then the remote worker is the exception. And so now you've got people from around the world applying for roles rather than just locally. And it creates a lot of challenges. Every role I look at has 600 to 1,000 competitors on it. Even if it says needs 7 years experience, 70% might be recent grads. And I remember living that life where I myself was the recent grad applying to senior roles and landed my first role on a contract for a major corporation. And it lasted 9 months. It was supposed to be 3 months and it lasted nine. And I exited when they moved locations. Myself rolling contract to contract for the first 3, 4 years of my career. Then I helped co-found a startup, and that startup ended up failing and moved on back to big corporations again, inevitably in the pandemic, becoming a manager for a major consultancy and working with 24 direct reports and 6 people management reports. So a lot of fun there. And then most recently worked as an architect for about a year, which, if you know the story of Icarus, he flew a bit too close to the sun. In some ways, I feel like I should not have moved from management to architecture, but I also am using those skills to work through a bundle I found from O'Reilly and Humble Bundle on architecture books and trying to figure out what could I have changed if I could have changed anything. Because obviously in this market, a lot of the time, it's not going to be your fault that your job ends. Unless you're a complete and utter jerk, you're going to find yourself being the result of a position elimination, layoffs, downturns, and we all know the economy right now is in a really bad place. So, what I would tell people right now in this market, don't beat yourself up. No resume writer is going to give you the right edge on things. I just share what worked for me in the past and always be upskilling.
So there's a lot going on there, a lot of good advice. It sounds like, first of all, you have a very diverse skill set. You've done a whole range of roles. You did both contract and full time, or full time as a contractor, and then what sounds like full time as a W-2 employee, and then shifting across different roles all the way up to management and even as an architect. So lots of resiliency there, which I think is a pretty big requirement as a software engineer. I think we find that, while it can work in some cases for people to stay in a very specific role, very targeted, and just do that their whole career, that does work in some cases, but a lot of times you do find yourself needing to grow and transition and kind of try a couple different things and not only see what works for you, but also be able to adjust for the way the market is headed. If things are shifting like they are right now with the emergence of all this generative AI, trying to find how your skill set can grow and fit into the ever-changing landscape. So I like the advice that you've got there for engineers. Building on top of that, for those out there who are looking to continue growing in their career, you mentioned constantly upskilling. Are there any other like high priority items that folks can integrate into their daily routine as developers to help them grow in their careers and kind of move up to the next level?
I think the biggest thing there, and I'm glad you asked that. I mean, right now we're sitting amidst a current event where the port strikes on the East Coast are shut down and everybody's going to be affected by it. And so it comes down to one of the sticking points there was people are afraid of automation. All of us are rightfully afraid of automation. Many of us have read Orwell. We know how the story goes. And so one thing I found has been successful in my career and most people I know that have been successful is always be adaptive. Understand that things are not going to be the same as they were even a year ago. Keep things to where you're open to change and learning new things. My favorite technology to work in would be the Java space. I like Java. Second most, I like Node and TypeScript. Kind of hate JavaScript. I'm good at it, but as a job description, I read somebody commented last night on LinkedIn, have you ever worked with this technology while angry? And they said that's a good indication of if you worked with it at a senior level. Is if you're angry at it, then you know what you love and hate. And so what I tell people and when I mentor people right now is I start with Java as my go-to. And if they want something else, I'll work elsewhere. I've got a student right now who wants to learn Go, wants to learn Rust, wants to learn Django and Python. Like that's not a simple plan. That's a multi-year effort if you want to get really good at it. You can learn the basics in a few weeks, and the basics are really what you're going to need in the job because you can learn any of it by going through Stack Overflow, using ChatGPT, whatever you need to upskill in the moment. But if you learn the basics and are flexible and pliable, it's going to take you a lot further than being a one-shot pony.
I like that. Yeah, the fundamentals are key. I find that to be true across all industries, really any area, whether it's playing sports or personal hobbies. If you can really get the fundamentals down, then it's easier to stay versatile and diversify and change as things are changing, but also pick up if something comes along that you've never seen before, be able to pick it up quickly. So yeah, I've found that to be true. You mentioned one of your mentees wanted to take on 2, 3, 4 different languages and frameworks all at once. And I think that sort of thing is probably the byproduct of not knowing what to do. I find the biggest thing, that one of the main questions that entry-level engineers are asking is like, what should I learn? And so if they don't have a mentor or a coach like yourself, what they do is they go out and they just get this like all these different opinions from the internet. You should learn this. Like, oh, everyone's hiring for Go. Everyone, you should learn Python. It's great, and if you know Python, then you can do machine learning, but you can also do data science. You can also do web. Like, it's so great. Everyone's using it, and they're like, okay, well, I need to learn both those things. And it's like, well, back up a second. How much about just programming in general do you understand? And if you were to start there, then you could potentially learn each of these languages as needed, and then maybe some frameworks on top of them. And especially in today's day and age, people kind of do things backwards with like coding boot camps. They generally teach more about the framework than they do the language. And that gets students from knowing nothing to being able to build like a CRUD app with some MVC architecture very quickly. But then they find themselves in the actual role and they're like, oh, I'm missing some of these core pieces that help me debug better and help me break down problems and really solve these day-to-day tasks. So I think your advice there to go back and really master the fundamentals before you branch out and try to take on what could be a multi-year venture trying to learn multiple languages and learn them well. is really sound advice. So that brings me to my next question. If you had to do all this over again to get to where you are now, what would that look like?
That's a multi-tier question. And so I have the advantage that when as a teenager, I had learned how to code. And so I learned C++. I had sold my first program for $10,000 at a computer show when I was 13. Yeah, 13. Windows 95 Rolodex program. And so had used a flat file database using Notepad to go ahead and look up the entries and create autocomplete that way. And then I went on, became a nursing assistant, worked in factories, worked fast food till I was close to 30. Out of fear. I grew up in poverty. I didn't have family that went to college. And so for me, there was always the fear of what if I take 4 years off and I fail? And then when the Great Recession happened, everybody's getting burned. I'm going to take out student loans, take my chances. And it worked out for me. But if I could do it again, I would definitely have not questioned myself as much. Additionally, going back to some of the things that I've done in recent years, transitioning from an engineer to a manager, I was driven a bit by fear because there's a lot of talk of ageism in this industry, and I turned 40 this past weekend. There's that real fear of, am I going to get aged out? So I'm like, I better get into management before I get too old. And I did, and I had really great mentors that helped me get there. So my book I had recently written, I mentioned one of them in the acknowledgments. And moving into architecture, again, I thought that it was a lateral move and it was a career change. It's something totally different set of skills that you're working with. And so the only thing they share in common is working in code. To give a couple of concrete examples, going into management, one of the projects I led a team on was one team was in Mexico, one team was in India, and two teams were in the States. And it was a COBOL transformation for a major corporation. COBOL DB2 moving over to Java, Spring, and Postgres. None of us had ever touched COBOL. We didn't have to look at the COBOL. We had to reverse engineer the program and figure out what it did, where it breaks, and how to make it work. And so bringing knowledge from the industry in helped a lot of knowing how old and new systems work, but nothing can prepare you for that except experience. Walking into architecture, I thought because I've worked with event-driven, message-driven, end-tier architectures that I know what I'm doing. I walked into a system using a microkernel architecture. I had no real idea what a microkernel was except for an operating system. So I ended up writing an extension for it, learning a lot. But then after that ended and during my research now, I'm starting to learn small differences in terminology that can make a huge difference in interviews. Somebody asks you, hey, why would you choose an event-driven versus a message-driven architecture? Many of us would say they're the same thing. But a book I was reading from O'Reilly was sharing in an event-driven architecture, the sender owns the connection to the event. In a message-driven architecture, the receiver owns that piece of where it receives. And so in the event-driven, the sender knows where it's going. In the message-driven, the receiver knows where it came from, but otherwise they're loosely coupled. These small distinctions make huge differences when you move into these higher levels of management and in engineering, because the decisions you make have impact not just on you, but on an entire team or an entire department. And so if I could do it over again, I definitely would have sought mentoring a lot sooner than I did. I simply asked, hey, where will I be in 5 years to my director? And he's like, you'll be an architect. Well, it took 7 years, but I got there. And I kind of wish that I'd asked them what pitfalls they'd seen, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, so you feel like maybe having a little more mentorship in advance could save you a lot of hard lessons learned and kind of streamline some things. I think there's a lot of value in that. It's good to have somebody who, or even a couple somebodies who have industry experience, who are in a role or have been in a role that you want to get into and can potentially save you a lot of time. And even, in today's day and age, a lot of that information can come from places like generative AI, taken with a little bit of salt, and places like YouTube. Because there are engineers out there who are kind of giving out this information to the masses for free about, things I wish I had known before I started, or top 10, yada, yada, yada. And so just knowing that you can go out there and find that information, that sort of thing was not available to engineers of our generation, where you did have to look to the person to your right or left and ask them, hey, what are some things that you can tell me about your journey and things I can avoid? So I think that's great advice. Very interesting about the COBOL migration. So that's like a very verbose language, right? COBOL.
It's very different from the modern object-oriented languages and how you think of things. I also, just to add a little more salt to that, I saw one of the influencers from Microsoft sharing how he had seen a piece of scheme code and how it triggered it because everything is center aligned. And it brought back fond memories. I'm like, scheme, again, a different kind of language where it's the language of parentheses. Each of these has their strengths and weaknesses, but I want to focus again on the transferable concepts. If you learn transferable concepts, things such as, was this done with an agile mindset, waterfall mindset, object-oriented, procedural, matters a lot less than what the end result is. If you got the end result in mind and you take the advice of the great Simon Sinek, start with why, not the how and what, but the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we hoping for this outcome? You get a lot better outcomes.
Yeah, so scheme is a flavor of Lisp, is that right?
Yes.
I remember learning it a little bit in one of the engineering books that I read, and I don't envy anybody that had to use that regularly in practice, although some people love it.
In grad school, we had to do 3 different things. I didn't finish my grad school. I went through all my core courses and then ran out of money for student loans. And so I went through all my core courses, but not my electives. And so I like to say that I basically have my graduate degree in computer science, but I don't have my graduate degree in computer science. They had us write the program using OCaml and then Scheme and then Haskell to go ahead and do the Cantor's uncountable set of the real numbers and go ahead and calculate the first n real numbers and the first n integers. And so you quickly learn you can't count all the real numbers, they're uncountable. But these languages can do it really fast and really clean without the need for exceptions due to being functional in nature. This is one of those things we don't teach in school any longer, is what is the difference between functional and object-oriented? Because everything's, okay, we're just going to go object-oriented or we're going to go JavaScript. People don't teach that JavaScript is a functional language. Removing that piece of ambiguity takes people a long way. You were mentioning the resources now, and I'm looking at you, Free Code Camp. You're amazing. You give hundreds and hundreds of hours of free stuff. The problem with that is you get one person's bias. Problem if you hire me, you get my bias. And that's where I tell people, get mentoring, but at the same time, make your own conclusions. An example of this is I was watching a master class on LangChain this week, and it occurred to me they're mentioning cosine angles, they're mentioning vectors, and they're using all these different ways to get around the fact that it's just basic linear algebra and multivariate calculus we're dealing with. In my mind, I'm going, okay, this is multivariate calculus and linear algebra. And so if I simply go in blindly and listen to what somebody says, I'm going to miss the bigger picture. So that's what I would say, is always zoom out, question everything. Never take anybody's word on it. Question everything. Because otherwise, you're going to regurgitate and you're going to see the same problems you've seen historically, where people make the same mistakes generation after generation instead of learning from them and coming to a better outcome.
Yep. It's these kinds of tips I think are most critical. A lot of juniors are looking for quick solutions. Which language do I learn? Which framework? How do I make the most money? Whatever it may be. And things like, get the fundamentals down. Doesn't matter which language, right? Got to get the fundamentals of programming down. Things like question everything, right? Get mentorship, but also question it and put it into practice. Because if you just take all these different, I think this is a common pattern for a lot of folks, is lots of input, whether it's from mentors or from YouTube or anywhere else, but not a lot of putting things into practice. So there's not a lot of doing past just the intake of everything. And I think a lot of the lessons, either you encounter lessons where you go, oh, that's what they were talking about. there's that pitfall, and then you can avoid it. Or you encounter new things and you realize, oh, this needs to be done differently based on all this input that I received. So I think a practical integration of all the different things that you're learning on a regular basis is also a really good habit to be able to take these things and actually learn from them and put them into practice repeatedly until you get to the point where you're where you are now. And I noticed just watching you on LinkedIn, you're constantly learning. You mentioned it a moment ago with the calculus course and the linear algebra. This constant upskilling, it never ends. And I've interviewed engineers who are close to retirement, and they're like, first of all, I'm not using anything that I used when I first started coding, other than the fundamentals, right? Like those concepts don't change, but with regards to the tools that I'm using, the languages that I'm working with, the frameworks that I'm working with, the stacks, everything's different now. The common thread there is that things are always changing. You'll always be learning. And if you're not learning on a regular basis, then you are potentially falling behind.
Yeah, to expound on what you said there, we look at, for example, the legendary Anders Helsberg. I'm probably slaughtering his name. He, if I recall, is the guy who invented both Delphi and C#. And so the two languages could not be further apart from each other. At the time, having the ability to do things in Pascal with Delphi was a really forward-thinking thing. I myself have programmed Pascal over the years and enjoyed it on hobby and for homework assignments. And then C# literally comes in, takes the world by storm, and changes what we all thought Java had an edge on. And it continued to evolve, started being a platform-dependent language, not platform-independent. If people had stuck with what they knew, we'd still be writing Pascal, and we'd be having a lot of challenges with how we scale it out for multiple operating systems, how we create web servers, et cetera, and so forth. And yeah, it's an interesting concept to think about, the growth mindset, and then we continue learning basically forevermore.
So you mentioned a little while ago that one of your mentors had asked you, either asked you where you'd be in 5 years, or they told you in 5 years you're going to be an architect. Looking at where you are now, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
That's a really good question. I've realized that while there's a progression to your career, there is a terminal point. Many people have spoken to the Peter Principle and how people get promoted to the level of their own incompetence. And so that's something I'm very self-aware of in my own career, that I don't want to ever fly too close to the sun. And so looking at myself right now, I see myself as enjoying code a lot more than I do the interaction with business people. And so while I have to have that necessary evil of a lot of meetings due to my status, being a senior engineer / principal, I have to also temper the fact of where are my strengths. So I kind of see myself stopping at a manager / architect, because that's the sweet spot where I can still be in the code and not be in all-day meetings like, say, a director or a CTO. But I also reflect back and I say, back in 2017, I helped be one of the founding members of a startup. And I really enjoyed that. I was working in the architecture space, working directly with the CEO, helping do vendor coordination and purchasing, trying to figure out what would work for our company, what wouldn't, being in charge of all hiring. And so that was a lot less coding than it was more the hands-on side of things, despite my title being programmer there. And so it's really something where I can say what I'm going to say today, but in 5 years from now, I'm probably going to have a different answer, because again, that whole growth mindset and evolving with time. Right now, I see myself being an engineer or architect or manager, but definitely not above that, not director level or chief architect, but we'll see where life takes us. Awesome.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of the journey is the destination sort of mentality. It also sounds like while you do love code, that principle that you mentioned earlier of zooming out and asking the why is also very important to you. And so roles like the one at the startup kind of facilitated that, where you're able to figure out the why. And I think at these higher level engineering roles, that becomes very important. The code becomes far less important. Once you figure out the why and you figure out the domain, and you figure out the plan for everything, then the implementation is just minor details a lot of the time. Sometimes, you get into the weeds of scaling and all that, but figuring out the why is far more important.
I find as you go up in engineering, a analogy that works really well is the analogy of a midwife. One woman can have birth one time a year, every 9 months. A midwife can help basically unlimited women with their birthing and help them with the journey. And so, as an engineer, there's a limit as to how many keystrokes we can hit, or how many things we can optimize, or how many meetings we can go to. But if we are creating a pathway, either as a manager to keep people out of the weeds of management, or as a principal engineer where you can create the architectural runway and the patterns and the boilerplate, you need to. One thing I see so many senior engineers do, and I hope I don't sound like I'm doing a word salad here. A lot of engineers, they are like, hey, I'm not doing as much. No, I'm not coding. You're actually doing a lot more. The imposter syndrome only gets worse as you move up, not easier. As you're going to continue to ask yourself, why am I worthy of this? What did I do to give myself this level of credit I'm given, or this level of pay? I struggle with it myself. Every successful engineer I've met has struggled with it. And so just realize, if you've been put in that position and you are seeing change and your team is succeeding, then you likely are succeeding, with rare exception. You may have a rock star on your team who's covering up for your incompetence, but more often than not, I feel like it's going to be a joint effort. We spend so much time as engineers, software engineers, wanting to work in a silo and not realize that the group is larger than the sum of the parts. We need that healthy balance of working in silos, but also keeping each other in the know, whether that be in the form of writing good documentation, or good status updates in a Scrum call, or just a simple Slack message to say, hey, I'm about to make this change. Are there any downstream impacts or lateral impacts to what you're doing? Rather than just assuming you know what it's going to be. We commonly, since we're creating something out of nothing, find ourselves having a God complex and a lot of hubris. And that, I find, is the downfall of a lot of teams, is when somebody wants to go in, everybody else needs to do a pull request, everybody else needs to get approvals, but me, no, the rules don't apply to me. I'm the senior, I'm the principal, I'm the architect. That is one of the most dangerous mistakes you can make, because I have learned more off of juniors on the job that have more recent experience. An example being 2016, 2017, NoSQL. In my college curriculum, we taught SQL. NoSQL was something that was not very widely used at that time. Learning Mongo off of one of my other engineers on the team took me to a whole new level. Then learning Lambdas from another engineer who was more junior to me on AWS took things to yet another level. And at first, my hackles go up. I'm skeptical. I don't like this. I don't like this. This is not what I'm used to. Now it's second nature. And so everything I'm going to sum up here is just always going to be adaptability and be open to change.
It sounds like, first of all, imposter syndrome is pervasive throughout the entire career. I think a lot of people feel like it's a very entry level thing. They get in their first role, or they're trying to get into their first role, or even moving into the second, and they feel like, I don't know what I'm doing. How did I get here? Do I deserve this? People are going to find me out. There's just this huge flood of information, and trying to navigate all of that is very difficult for a lot of people. But it doesn't stop there, right? As you mentioned, it goes all the way into these very senior, even director level roles, where folks are still saying, should I be where I am? Am I having the impact that I should be making? How did I end up here? Am I the right person for this role? Things like that. But what you mentioned with regards to adaptability and continuous learning and growth, I think personally, I've always advocated that is probably one of the best solutions to mitigating imposter syndrome. Is just always be curious, always be learning, put your ego aside. And like you mentioned earlier, where if you're constantly integrating things that you learn, even if it's a quote unquote failure, if you use it as a learning technique to grow and do better the next time around, then it's not a failure, right? It's just a tool to help you grow and succeed next time. And so those sorts of things can really offset some of those feelings that creep in and make you feel like you're less than something you really are. Even though for any of us who have encountered it, we know that most of that, probably all of that, is happening up here, and it's kind of an inner battle. I don't think our coworkers are going around, thinking to themselves, "Oh, this person shouldn't be in that role." Well, I mean, that sort of thing may happen from time to time, but that's more of probably like a personal bias or beef, and less than like that person isn't qualified. But we tell ourselves a lot of wild things in our head, and it doesn't stop even later in your career. So
I'm going to go back to when I was first starting out. So I had one contract that only lasted for about 7 weeks before the entire department got scrapped over November for Thanksgiving, week before Thanksgiving. My boss calls me in and she says, I need you to work over the weekend. We're going to authorize overtime. And so this is going to be big money. We're talking about back when I'm starting, $160K a year as a recent grad. I'm like, holy crap, this is amazing. I come out of that meeting, I'm walking on air. I called my wife, told her, hey, I'm working all weekend, but we're going to make some good money. Let's plan a nice trip. Not 10 minutes later, this older guy who's been in the industry 30 years, he grabs his fist and starts slamming it into the desk and screaming at me and saying, you're not qualified for this job, again and again. I remember right there on the job, losing my composure and running out of the room and asking, should I really be in this field? Because I'm a little over a year in at that point. And I'm driving home, and the recruiter calls me and tells me, hey, your position's been eliminated. And I said, no. My boss told me to work over the weekend. Recruiter tells me your boss doesn't work there anymore either. I'm like, well, then call the director. The director knows. The director doesn't work there either. The CEO came in, cut the project from the head down. If it weren't for that recruiter giving me that feedback, all I would have went on was the guy telling me I wasn't qualified, but my manager telling me that I was doing a great job. Over the course of my career, there have been more than once where I went in thinking everything's fine, or getting a contract renewal, or even going to a performance review and learning, hey, something didn't go right, or being told some very ambiguous reason that, we need to do better, or hey, we're cutting for this ambiguous reason. Only to learn from that manager a year later, hey, I shouldn't have been a manager at the time. I wasn't in the right headspace, or, the company was doing some very nefarious things and it wasn't your fault or mine. And I hope you can forgive me for not being able to tell you that at the time. And so that's something I would recommend people is realize a lot of these layoffs or even some of these ambiguous PIPs that come out nowadays are oftentimes not your fault, and not to let it eat you alive, because companies, like individuals, don't want scarlet letters. They don't want to be seen in a negative light. They don't want to be in the press. And so just keep moving forward. Always push on, and always know that provided you're learning and you're keeping your skills fresh, it's not always your fault. I had a student recently ask me just last week, he's like, I must not be very senior because all my rejection emails are form letters. I tell him, I'm 10 years in. I just got done applying for a principal role, and I went through 6 rounds of interviews, and I did not even get a phone call, did not even get a personalized email, just we moved on with a candidate who's more qualified 10 minutes after I finished the interview. No feedback on what I did right or what I did wrong. Just, hey, we moved on with another person. We know that's not what you want to hear. And so, I've known C-suiters, CTOs, CIOs who get the same form emails. It's all about legality and making sure the company doesn't run afoul of legal and get sued because they said something that is misconstrued and somebody wants to get them in the press. And so that's another thing I give to people who are aspiring is realize more often than not, we get mental, but it's not about us. It's not personal. It's just business. And as much as that sucks.
Yeah, your story about the engineer of 30 years that kind of threw the tantrum and that made you feel the way you felt, and then you had this follow-up information a little while later that kind of helped you piece things together. I think that's a really interesting lesson, is that we're walking around on a day-to-day basis with this mental model of our reality, and we're pulling in whatever input we can, and we're forming these conclusions about everything, right? And with regards to things like work, sometimes, and not sometimes, all the time, we only have half the story, or maybe far less, but we still form these conclusions. And then we tell ourselves things about ourselves or things about others and things about the project. And if we gain a little bit of awareness and remind ourselves on a regular basis that we're always working with partial information, then it's easier for us to be less reactive, to look for more information, right? To form better conclusions. And that sort of thing can trickle over into our work as well. We realize, oh, this is why figuring out the why is so important. Because if we're only working with a small piece of information, and anybody who's done any amount of debugging on a project knows that if you don't have a bunch of answers first, then you're going to spend a lot of time finding them. And so sometimes you can solve a bug that might take you 3 days or a week simply by communicating with someone else who's got that piece of information siloed away. And you say, hey, do you know about blah, blah, blah? 10 seconds later, they've said, yeah, look over here. And they point you to the next piece of information you need. So just reminding yourself that before you come to conclusions that can end up having very serious consequences with regards to your actions, to zoom out, like you mentioned earlier, and just look at the bigger picture and ask yourself, do I have all the information to really know that what I'm thinking is true? Whether it's me thinking something negative about myself, like imposter syndrome, or a coworker, or a company I work for, or the job market, or a project that I'm working on. It can be something big or small, but using that same line of thinking to always realize, like, is what I'm thinking is true? And it goes back to what you said, question everything, right? Question it, be curious, learn from your mistakes, always be looking for new information, and always be learning, right?
I think that basically summarizes a lot of what I would have to say regarding my career path. And is there anything else you would like to ask in closing of me?
For folks that are interested in you mentioned you do some coaching, and you mentioned you do some resume review. If folks want to find you for that, or if someone has heard you talking here and is interested in interviewing you, potentially they have a role available since you are at this current time looking for your next gig, where can they find you?
I would recommend starting out with my LinkedIn. Just look my name up. Probably it'll show up as Azadi B, because I'd like to keep people from sending me spam. So that way it's somebody knows who I am rather than finding me via relevance searches. So from there, you can find my website. Right now, it's not very indexable. That's deliberate. I don't want to get so busy that I can't interview, but over time, I'm going to make that a more search indexable website. Right now, it's azadibogolubov.github.io, but probably will eventually be something like degreesoffreedomcoaching.com. But yeah, you can find me on there, shoot me a message, or find my website via the profile page. And I try to meet people where they're at and make everything completely customized to where they're at. Because like many, I'm a career changer. I didn't come out at 18 and go to college doing this. I worked in other industries. And so I am good at helping people out for career changers predominantly, but I've also helped a number of people who started their career in tech understand things. Though I find career changers are the ones I relate to the best, is they are the ones who know why they want to do it rather than just having been funneled into it. And so I do let that come out at the outset of my sessions as well, that I don't have the perspective of somebody who has always done tech. A lot of my analogies are going to come from other industries. So
awesome. Well, Azadi, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been wonderful chatting with you. I've learned a lot. Hopefully our viewers are also taking away some useful information, and they know where to find you if they want to follow up with any questions or your services as a coach and mentor.
yeah.
So appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on the podcast. I appreciate it. You have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too.